In one European city, people believed their fire bell was cursed. Every time it rang for a major blaze, someone disappeared afterward. Not burned, not buried, just gone. For generations, the city accepted this as coincidence, until one winter morning the bell cracked open by itself. Inside the bronze, fused together by soot and pressure, were human bones, skulls worn smooth, limbs bent to fit the shape of the metal, and human teeth embedded in the bell's walls, as if the people it took had tried to bite their way out. What no one expected was the truth that followed. When the bell broke, the city burned worse than ever before. Because the bell had not only been killing people, it had been holding something back. The first thing the city lost was not a person, but a sound. One morning the bell rang, and its echo did not fade. It clung to the air like damp wool, pressing into ears, into teeth, into the soft places behind the eyes. People swore the vibration stayed inside their skulls for hours, humming long after the rope went slack. Birds fell silent, dogs whimpered and hid, and by nightfall the city felt hollowed, as if something essential had been scooped out and left hanging above the square in bronze. The bell had always been there, older than living memory, its dark body suspended in the tower like a lung that breathed panic. It had called the city awake for fires, for raids, for moments when fear needed a single shape. Its surface was scarred with soot and streaked by centuries of rain, and when the wind shifted, it carried a faint metallic odor that mingled with smoke and old stone. Children grew up measuring danger by its sound, learning the difference between a short warning and a long, desperate toll. The bell was not loved, but it was obeyed. After that morning, obedience turned into unease. People moved through the square with shoulders tight and jaws clenched, as if the air itself had weight. The echo lingered invisibly, making every footstep feel intrusive, every breath too loud. Bakers burned bread without noticing, scribes pressed too hard and tore parchment, and hands shook for no clear reason. The bell did not ring again that day, yet its presence felt stronger than ever, looming above the city like an accusation. By evening, the smells returned first. Not fire, not rot, but something sharper, a dry, acrid tang that clung to clothing and hair. It reminded the older citizens of mornings after great blazes, when ashes settled into window frames and throats burned for days. No flames had risen, no roofs had collapsed, yet the city reacted as though disaster had already passed through. Doors were barred earlier than usual, candles extinguished quickly, and prayers whispered without direction. In the night, sleep came poorly. Those who lay beneath the tower dreamed of pressure, of being pressed inward from all sides, of bronze closing around them with slow, patient force. Some woke with bleeding gums, others with ringing ears that would not quiet. A few claimed they could feel the bell's shape inside their chests, heavy and cold, matching their breath. By dawn, the square was empty, avoided by instinct rather than order. When the sun rose fully, the city took stock and noticed the second loss. A man who had rung the bell the previous morning did not return home. His tools lay neatly arranged, his door unforced, his bed untouched. His name was spoken briefly, then folded away into the day's work. The bell loomed above, silent now, its mouth dark and unreadable, holding whatever answer it had already taken inside itself. The bell had hung there since the previous century, dark with age, its surface scarred by soot and old rain. It was rung for fires, for warnings, for moments when panic needed a voice louder than screams. After every great blaze, when the streets still stank of ash and boiled pitch, someone failed to return home. A cooper, a midwife, a watchman, always someone ordinary, always someone whose name slipped easily into memory and then out again. The city learned to count the dead twice, once in the flames and once in the silence that followed the bell. At first, the pattern hid itself in coincidence. Fires were common, lives fragile, and loss an expected weight. Roofs caught, workshops flared, chimneys spat sparks into dry wind, and the bell answered as it always had, swinging its bronze throat open to the sky. When the flames were beaten back and the streets cooled, a space would remain where a person should have been. A stool empty at a table, a door left unlatched, a tool abandoned mid-task. The city absorbed these absences the way stone absorbs heat, slowly, without protest. The bell's surface bore the record of those years. Its metal was pitted and uneven, marked by hairline fractures that filled with grime and soot. When the sun struck it at certain angles, the bronze looked bruised, almost soft, as if pressure from within had pushed outward and failed. Rainwater collected in its grooves and ran down in dark streaks, leaving stains that never fully washed away. Those who climbed the tower to maintain the ropes reported a smell that clung to their clothes, a blend of wet metal and old smoke, sharper near the bell's mouth, where the air seemed to stagnate. As decades passed, the disappearances became harder to dismiss. They did not cluster among the reckless or the poor, nor did they spare the careful or the devout. They followed fires with an unsettling loyalty, arriving not during the chaos but afterward, when the city exhaled and began to rebuild. The missing were never found in the ruins. No bodies surfaced in wells or cellars, no bones turned up in gardens. It was as if they had stepped sideways, out of reach, leaving only the faint impression of having been there at all. The bell's sound changed with time, though few noticed at once. What had once been a clear, commanding ring grew denser, as if the air itself resisted it. The vibration traveled differently, settling into walls and bodies rather than dissipating upward. Windows rattled longer, chests tightened, and ears rang well into the night. Children learned to cover their mouths when it rang, not from instruction but from instinct, as though the sound demanded a physical response to keep something from entering. Those who pulled the rope felt it most keenly. The task rotated, shared among men accustomed to strain, yet each described a similar aftermath. Hands tingled and went numb, wrists ached as though the bones had been compressed, and the taste of iron lingered on the tongue. Some spat blood hours later, thin and bright, without having bitten themselves. Others complained of a heaviness behind the sternum, a pressure that made deep breaths feel intrusive. None refused the duty outright, but many delayed, inventing small excuses, stretching moments thin before stepping into the tower. The square beneath the bell acquired habits of its own. Pigeons avoided the tower, circling wide and landing elsewhere, their absence noted only when droppings no longer marked the stones. Dogs balked at crossing the center, lowering their bodies and skirting the edges with tails tucked. On warm days, when the rest of the city smelled of bread and tanned leather, the square held onto the scent of old smoke, dry and persistent, as if the bell exhaled it slowly between tolls. Records were kept, though quietly. Clerks noted names and dates in the margins of fire reports, marking those who did not reappear. Over time, these annotations formed a parallel history, one written in cramped script and crossed-out hopes. Attempts were made to trace connections. None were found beyond the bell itself and the fires that summoned it. The missing shared no trade, no district, no known vice. Their only common thread was timing, their absence stitched neatly to the aftermath of sound. The city adapted, as cities do. Families learned to hold on to one another after fires, counting heads with nervous smiles. Neighbors checked doors and windows, lingering longer than necessary before returning to routine. Yet vigilance dulled with repetition, and fear, when stretched thin, becomes background noise. The bell continued to hang, to ring, to preside. Its authority remained unquestioned, its necessity assumed. Fires without it would have been unthinkable, and so the city accepted the cost without naming it. There were moments, brief and easily dismissed, when the bell seemed to answer back. After certain tolls, a low resonance lingered, not audible so much as felt, a tremor in the stones that lasted longer than expected. Candles guttered without draft, and dust fell from rafters in slow, deliberate showers. These occurrences were attributed to age, to weather, to imagination. No one suggested the bell might be responding, because response implied appetite, and appetite implied intent. Years layered themselves onto the tower like soot. Children grew into adults who remembered names their parents had spoken only once. The bell remained, darkening further, its mouth a permanent shadow against the sky. Each fire added to its history, each absence another weight it carried without visible strain. The city learned, without ever agreeing aloud, that the bell's work did not end when the flames died. It continued afterward, quietly, patiently, completing a second tally no one could see, but everyone felt in the long, uneasy silence that followed its last note. As the years passed, the sound of it began to change. It grew thicker, lower, less like metal, and more like breath forced through clenched teeth. The toll no longer leapt outward. It pressed inward, collapsing space rather than crossing it. The air seemed to resist, bowing under the vibration, and those who stood in the square felt it travel through bone before it reached the ear. After each ringing, the city carried the sound inside itself like a swallowed object, heavy and difficult to place. The men assigned to the rope aged quickly, their hands lost feeling first, fingertips blanching and tingling as though exposed to winter water. Gums bled without injury, mouths tasting of copper long after the tower was locked again. Several developed a persistent ache behind the breastbone, a pressure that deepened when they lay flat, forcing them to sleep upright in chairs. Physicians blamed posture, labor, damp air. None examined the bell. The rope fibers grew slick and dark from use, and those who touched them noticed the faint residue it left on skin, a soot-like dust that resisted washing. The square beneath the tower took on a permanent character, independent of season. Rain failed to clear the smell. Even after weeks without fire, the stones breathed out smoke, dry and acrid, as if heat lingered below the surface. Bread carried through the square cooled too quickly, leather stiffened, and water drawn from nearby wells tasted flat. Pigeons, once a constant presence, abandoned the area entirely, choosing ledges farther down the street. When they passed overhead, they did not circle, they crossed with purpose, wings beating faster, bodies angled away from the tower, as if correcting for an unseen force. Mothers learned the rhythm of the rope and reacted before the sound fully formed. Children were pulled indoors, shutters closed, hearths damped. The fear was no longer of flame racing through streets, but of what followed the bell's call, the invisible accounting that seemed to begin only after the ringing stopped. The city had absorbed the lesson slowly, through repetition rather than decree. Fires were fought with urgency, but the aftermath was met with quiet vigilance, neighbors watching one another with careful eyes, counting movements, noting who lingered too long near the square. Small changes accumulated in those who lived closest to the tower. Sleep grew shallow. Dreams took on weight and texture, filled with pressure and enclosure. Some woke convinced they had been pressed into narrow spaces, unable to move, lungs straining against resistance. Others reported hearing the bell without sound, a vibration felt rather than perceived, arriving in the early hours and fading only with daylight. These experiences were shared rarely and cautiously, as if naming them might invite repetition. The bell itself bore the marks of its altered labor. Its surface darkened unevenly, patches of bronze dulled to near black, while other areas gleamed with an unnatural polish, as though rubbed from within. Fine cracks multiplied, radiating from the lip and climbing toward the crown. They were too narrow to admit a blade, yet wide enough to catch soot, forming lines that resembled veins beneath skin. When struck by sun, these lines absorbed light rather than reflecting it, giving the bell a bruised, swollen appearance. Maintenance became increasingly difficult. The tower's interior felt close, air thick and unmoving. Ladders creaked under weight they had borne for decades without complaint. Those tasked with inspection reported vertigo, an unsteady pull toward the bell's mouth that required conscious effort to resist. Dust fell constantly, black and fine, settling into hair and clothing, carrying the same dry, burned scent as the square below. Tools left overnight developed a dull film, and metal fittings showed accelerated corrosion, as if time itself moved differently near the bell. The city's records grew more detailed as anxiety sharpened attention. Clerks tracked not only fires and absences, but duration of ringing, weather conditions, wind direction. Patterns suggested themselves and dissolved under scrutiny. Longer tolls seemed to precede longer silences, but exceptions undermined certainty. Fires during heavy rains still resulted in disappearances. Calm days proved no safer than turbulent ones. The only constant remained the bell's voice, thickening with each passing year, acquiring a weight that no longer felt proportional to its size. Those who attempted to leave the city after a fire often returned. Journeys were cut short by illness, accidents, inexplicable delays. Wagons broke axles, horses balked, roads flooded without rain. The bell's sound, though unheard beyond the walls, seemed to reach them regardless, manifesting as pressure in the ears or a sudden, overwhelming fatigue. The city became a closed system, held together by habit and something less definable, a gravity centered on the tower. Ritual crept in where understanding failed. People washed hands and faces after the bell rang, scrubbing until skin reddened. Windows were opened in precise sequences, doors closed in specific orders. None of it altered outcomes, but the actions spread, copied, and repeated, providing the illusion of participation in forces otherwise unreachable. The bell remained indifferent, hanging silent between calls, its presence felt even when untouched. Over time, the fear shifted shape. It lost sharpness and gained density, settling into the routines of daily life. Children learned which streets to avoid after fires. Elders chose seats with backs to walls. Merchants closed early without complaint. The bell's payment, once unspoken, became an accepted cost, its mechanism inscrutable but dependable. Each toll carried an unspoken addition, a second consequence that followed the sound like an afterimage. By then, the city no longer questioned whether the bell took something. The question had narrowed to what it did with what it took, and whether the growing weight of its voice signaled hunger deepening rather than satisfied. The sound continued to thicken, to lower, to press. And beneath it all, the square breathed smoke, the tower radiated heat, and the bell waited, patient and unchanged in purpose, for the next moment when panic would need a voice louder than screams. During the Great Fire of the middle of the century, the worst the city had known, the bell was rung until the tower trembled. The first flames rose at dusk, thin and fast, slipping along rooftops like spilled oil. By nightfall the city glowed from within, streets washed in red light, windows bursting outward in sharp, ringing breaths. Smoke rolled low and thick, pressing into lungs until every inhale tasted of copper and charred grain. The bell answered without pause, its voice no longer a warning but a command, driving people into motion even as the sound crushed against their ribs. The rope burned hands raw. Men rotated in frantic shifts, hauling until shoulders failed and vision narrowed. Each toll landed heavier than the last, the vibration traveling through stone and bone alike. The tower shuddered, dust raining from beams, bells of smaller chapels answering weakly before falling silent, overwhelmed. Below, the city unraveled. Roofs collapsed inward with wet, choking roars. Barrels burst, sending boiling pitch through alleys where it stuck to skin and cloth. The air grew so dense with heat that breath itself felt flammable. When dawn finally came, it arrived pale and distant, filtered through smoke that refused to lift. The fire had eaten its fill and moved on, leaving behind blackened ribs of houses and streets carpeted with ash. Survivors wandered without direction, faces streaked gray, eyes rimmed red and glassy. Names were called and went unanswered. Tools lay where they had fallen. Doors stood open to rooms that no longer existed. At first, the missing were counted with urgency, hope clinging stubbornly to the idea of delay or injury. By the second day, hope thinned. The absences were too clean. More than one person had vanished, not trapped beneath debris, not burned beyond recognition, but simply removed. Beds were empty without scorch. Shoes waited by doors that still stood. A child's cup sat unbroken on a table in a house reduced to a single wall. The pattern, once subtle, now felt intentional. It was no longer lost by chance, but lost by selection. The bell hung silent after the fire, its ropes slack and darkened, fibers stiff with residue. Those who passed beneath the tower reported an unease sharper than before, a sense of proximity to something that had just finished feeding. The square smelled wrong. Not merely of smoke, but of something sweet beneath it, faint and cloying, like meat left too long near heat. No birds returned. Even flies avoided the space, circling wide before settling elsewhere. Within a week, the bell began to change. Fine cracks appeared along its flank, so narrow they were first mistaken for soot patterns. They ran vertically and diagonally, branching and reconnecting, tracing paths that suggested pressure from within rather than impact from without. From these lines seeped a black dust, dry and granular, collecting at the base of the tower and staining the stone. When disturbed, it released a smell that turned stomachs, faintly organic, unmistakably burned. Those tasked with inspection climbed the tower reluctantly. Inside, the air was hot despite the season, unmoving and stale. The bell loomed larger than memory allowed, its interior swallowed by shadow. When lantern light brushed the cracks, they appeared deeper than expected, edges smooth and worn, as if rubbed repeatedly. The dust coated everything, clinging to skin and cloth, resisting removal. One man retched before reaching the top rung, overcome by the smell, his knees buckling as though the space itself pressed downward. Word spread quickly, stripped of embellishment by fear. People avoided the square entirely. Markets shifted streets. Processions rerouted without explanation. The bell was no longer merely feared. It was regarded with a wary respect reserved for forces that had proven themselves capable of preference. The city understood, without discussion, that the Great Fire had marked a transition. Whatever balance had existed before had shifted. The bell had rung longer than ever, and its appetite had grown accordingly. At night, the tower emitted faint sounds. Not a ringing, not even a vibration, but a low settling noise, like material cooling after heat. Some described it as a slow grinding, others as a distant chewing, though none were willing to repeat the word aloud. Dreams returned, heavier than before, filled with images of enclosure and pressure, of bodies compressed into narrow spaces, of breath forced out inch by inch. Those who woke nearest the tower often did so gasping, hands pressed to chests that felt bruised from within. The city council debated removal. The bell was damaged, they argued, unsafe. Cracks compromised its integrity. But no one volunteered to oversee the work. The last fire had left scars too fresh, the memory of selection too raw. Practical concerns tangled with something more primitive. The bell had endured centuries. It had protected the city even as it took from it. To interfere now felt less like repair and more like provocation. Weeks passed. The black dust continued to seep, accumulating despite attempts to clean it away. Each morning it returned, fine and patient, settling into grooves and mortar. Rain did not wash it off. It merely spread it thinner, staining stone a dull gray. Children who tracked it on their shoes were scrubbed harshly, skin reddened, mothers unwilling to explain why. The smell lingered on fingers long after contact, impossible to ignore once noticed. The missing were never found. No remains surfaced when rubble was cleared. No bones turned up and foundations laid anew. It was as if the fire had burned selectively, leaving behind only what could be rebuilt and taking what could not be replaced. The bell watched over the reconstruction in silence, its cracked surface darkening further, its interior unreadable. By the end of the season, the city understood that the Great Fire had been more than disaster. It had been a transaction. The bell had been rung until the tower trembled, and something had answered from within the bronze. The cracks along its flank marked not damage, but strain, evidence of a capacity tested and expanded. Whatever lived inside the sound had chosen more than before, and the city, in its rebuilding, did so under the weight of a new certainty. The next time the bell rang that long, the payment would be higher still. The bell cracked fully on a cold morning when there was no fire at all. Frost glazed the rooftops, and the air lay still, brittle enough to snap with breath. The first sound came without warning, a deep internal failure that traveled through the tower before it reached the square. It was not a ring but a wet, tearing groan, like metal being pulled apart from the inside by something that resisted release. Stone shuddered. Windows rattled. People clutched at chests and door frames as the vibration passed through bone and settled behind the eyes. The tower did not collapse at once. It held for a long, impossible moment, beams creaking, dust sifting down in thin curtains. Then the bell tore free. Its fall was short but final, bronze striking stone with a sound that cut off abruptly, as if swallowed mid-breath. The square seemed to recoil, the impact sending a shock through the ground that traveled into boots and up legs. Silence followed, heavy and absolute, the kind that presses inward rather than spreading out. Despite fear, the city gathered. Doors opened, windows filled with faces. People moved toward the square without speaking, drawn by a need that felt older than reason. The bell lay split where it had struck, its shell ruptured along the same lines that had crept across it for years. The cracks had opened wide. Petals of bronze peeled back to expose an interior no one had imagined, though many had feared. Inside lay bones. They were fused together by soot and residue, layered and compacted, as if arranged under immense pressure. Long bones were bent and darkened, skull fragments polished smooth where they had rubbed against metal. The mass carried a shape, rounded and deliberate, filling the bell's cavity as though it had grown there. Ash coated everything, but beneath it the bone shone dully, worn by contact and time. When the frost melted where breath fell upon it, the smell rose unmistakably, the same faint sweetness that had lingered in the square after fires, now stronger, undeniable. Closer inspection revealed details that turned stomachs. Grooves ran along many of the bones, shallow but consistent, curved in patterns that suggested repetition rather than impact. They were not fractures from collapse or heat. They resembled bite marks, impressed patiently, over years, by something strong enough to work bone down slowly. Teeth were found lodged in the bronze itself, embedded where the metal had softened and then hardened again. Human teeth, worn flat at the edges, some cracked, some polished smooth by friction. They had scraped and chewed and waited, trapped in metal that had not released them. No one touched the remains at first. The square filled with the low sounds of breathing, of fabric shifting, of bodies adjusting to the cold. Faces held expressions that wavered between horror and recognition. Names surfaced in minds without being spoken. The cooper, the midwife, the watchman. The figures who had failed to return after fires now felt suddenly present, their absence condensed into something solid and irrefutable. Those who had rung the bell in past years felt it most acutely. Their hands ached with a remembered pressure, their gums throbbed, their chests tightened as if the weight had been there all along, only now revealed. Some sank to their knees. Others turned away, retching into the frost. The city's physicians arrived late, moving carefully, their authority drained by what lay before them. There was nothing to diagnose, nothing to explain away. The evidence resisted classification. It was not accident, not collapse, not fire alone. As the day wore on, the cold retreated and the square warmed under weak sun. With warmth came movement. Flies appeared, tentative at first, then bold. The smell deepened. Someone covered the remains with cloth, but the fabric darkened immediately, soaked through by soot and something thicker. When the cloth was removed, it clung, threads caught on bone and metal alike, resisting separation. The bell's interior told a story without sequence. Bones from different bodies were fused together, some bearing marks of heat, others untouched by flame. A child's small arm lay pressed against an adult's rib, both worn smooth where bronze had rubbed them over time. There were no complete skeletons, only parts, rearranged by pressure and motion. The bell had not collected whole bodies. It had processed them. Debate rose, cautious and fragmented. Some argued for burial, others for destruction. A few insisted on preservation, as proof, as warning. But beneath these arguments lay a deeper realization that no one voiced directly. The bell had not merely taken people. It had used them. It had transformed sound into substance, panic into structure, bodies into ballast. The thickening of its voice, the growing weight of its toll, now made terrible sense. As dusk approached, the city's fear shifted. The bell was broken, its appetite exposed. Relief should have followed. Instead, unease deepened. The bell had fallen without fire, without provocation. It had cracked under its own accumulation, its internal pressure finally exceeding the strength of bronze. If it had been containing something, regulating something, what now took its place? That night, fires burned unchecked in distant quarters, small at first, then spreading. Without the bell's warning, Alarms came too late. People ran without direction, lacking the single sound that had once unified response. The city felt suddenly vast and disjointed, each street isolated. Those who fled the square swore they felt lighter as they moved away, as if leaving behind a gravity while they had lived within unknowingly. The remains were guarded until morning. No one slept easily. Dreams returned, altered now by certainty. There were no longer questions of whether the bell had taken lives, only how many and why. The bell lay silent, split and inert, its work laid bare. Yet in the quiet hours before dawn, some claimed they felt a familiar pressure behind the eyes, a phantom vibration without source, as if the city itself still remembered the weight it had carried. By morning, the crowd returned, smaller, more deliberate. Decisions would be made. The bell would be melted, repurposed, erased. But as the sun climbed, glinting off exposed bone and torn bronze, one truth settled over the square with the cold clarity of frost. The bell had not been an anomaly. It had been a solution. And with its breaking, the city faced the prospect of discovering what its hunger had been holding back all along. The horror did not end with the discovery. In the days that followed, as the bell lay broken and exposed to the weather, the city felt a subtle loosening, as if a tension long held had been released without warning. The square, once avoided, became merely empty, stripped of the gravity that had shaped movement for generations. People spoke of relief and closure, mistaking absence for safety. The tower stood mute, its ropes slack, its shadow shortened by the season, and for the first time in memory the city faced a fire without a voice to gather it. The first blaze after the fall began quietly. A kitchen hearth flared, a spill of fat caught, and flames climbed a wall with deceptive calm. There was shouting, but no single sound to organize it. No heavy toll to cut through confusion and bind panic into purpose. Buckets came too late. Ladders were misdirected. The fire moved as if unobserved, spreading sideways before it rose, slipping into attics and crawl spaces where heat gathered unseen. By the time the city understood the scale of it, the streets were already choked with smoke. Without the bell, the fires behaved differently. They burned faster, hotter, with an appetite that felt focused rather than random. Winds carried embers farther. Roofs failed in quick succession, collapsing not inward but outward, pushing flame into open air where it leapt greedily to the next structure. People fled without coordination, crowding alleys, tripping over one another, drawn into dead ends by instinct rather than guidance. Smoke thickened until it erased landmarks, swallowing streets whole. People vanished again. Not singly, not quietly, but in clusters, entire households overtaken at once. The missing were no longer absences discovered in daylight, but losses witnessed in real time, bodies lost to smoke and heat before anyone could count them. There was no second tally, no delayed accounting. The city bled openly, and there was no mechanism left to slow the hemorrhage. As fires repeated themselves over the following weeks, understanding crept in with the weight of inevitability. The bell had not merely taken lives. It had shaped disaster. It had compressed chaos into a single axis, forced panic into a channel that could be endured. In consuming a few, it had restrained the many. Its appetite had been a boundary, terrible but functional, a limit imposed on forces otherwise indifferent to survival. The bell had digested fear and flesh alike, transforming both into a sound that contained what it summoned. This realization did not bring comfort. It brought anger, sharp and directionless. The city had lived under a bargain it had never agreed to, protected by a mechanism that demanded blood without explanation. Now, stripped of it, the city faced the raw version of itself, unmediated and uncontrolled. The bell's silence was not peace. It was exposure. The fragments were gathered with urgency, driven by a belief that destruction might substitute for understanding. Bronze petals were hauled from the square, pried free from bone and soot. The remains were separated as best as hands could manage, though many pieces refused distinction, fused too tightly by heat and pressure to yield cleanly. What could be buried was buried. What could not was wrapped and set aside, an unresolved mass that no one wished to name. When the bronze was melted down, the city assembled again, drawn by a need that now felt compulsory. Furnaces were stoked high, their mouths glowing white. As the fragments were fed into the heat, something unexpected occurred. The metal screamed. It was not the hiss of impurities burning off, nor the crackle of cooling stone. It was a sustained, piercing sound that rose from the vats themselves, vibrating the ground, setting teeth on edge, forcing hands to clamp over ears. Those who stood closest felt the pressure return, familiar and crushing, as if the bell's voice had been trapped in its own substance and was now being torn free. The scream ended abruptly when the last fragment softened and sank. Silence followed, deeper than before, stripped of echo or afterimage. The molten bronze settled, surface smoothing into an inert, reflective skin. Whatever had been bound within it did not survive the process intact. The city mistook this for victory. The first new fire without the bell came that same night. It began in multiple places at once, as if sparked by a shared impulse rather than chance. Flames rose in different quarters, separated by distance yet united in timing. Smoke layered the streets, heavy and fast, denying breath before heat could warn. Without a central sound, the city fractured, each district fighting alone, resources scattered, efforts duplicated or wasted. By dawn, half the city was gone. Not damaged, not scarred, but erased. Whole streets smoldered where buildings had stood. Walls leaned into open air, their interiors exposed like ribs. The dead were too many to count properly, their bodies arranged by collapse and drift rather than ritual. The survivors wandered through ash without direction, stunned by the scale of loss that had unfolded in a single, uncontained night. No one rang a bell to mark the dead. There was nothing left to ring, and no one wished to hear such a sound again. The city learned to live with smaller fires, frequent and devastating, each one a reminder of what restraint had cost and what its absence demanded. Reconstruction proceeded unevenly, haunted by the knowledge that something essential had been dismantled in the name of justice. In time, the story hardened into warning. The bell became legend, its appetite exaggerated, its purpose misunderstood. Some claimed it had been cursed, others that it had been a demon in metal form. Few spoke of containment. Fewer still acknowledged the comfort of predictability it had once provided. Silence filled the space where sound had governed, and in that silence, fear learned to roam freely. The city endured, reduced, and altered, its skyline lowered, its confidence burned away. Fires still came, and people still vanished, now without pattern or pause. The square remained empty, an unmarked void where nothing would ever hang again. No metal was trusted with such authority. No sound was allowed to rise above screams. What the bell had been willing to eat, the city now consumed itself. And in the quiet that followed each disaster, there was no echo left to cling to the air, no heavy vibration to settle behind the eyes. Only the knowledge that some hungers, once fed, do not disappear when starved, but spread, unbounded, through streets that have forgotten the cost of being held together.